Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for your patience this morning as we had some technical difficulties. This webinar is the first in a series of capacity building webinars hosted by Sea Alliance in collaboration with Global Tuna Alliance, World Benchmarking Alliance, and FishWise. My name is Garrett Okrasinski, and I'm a project director on the social responsibility team at FishWise, and I'll be facilitating the presentation today. FishWise is a nonprofit consultancy with a mission to sustain ocean ecosystems and the people who depend on them by transforming global seafood supply chains. Today, we'll be discussing human rights due diligence, what it is and why companies should engage. This webinar is being recorded and participants' audio and video functions are disabled. However, we encourage you to engage via the question and answer feature, and we'll ask for you to complete 3 polls that will be sent out during the presentations. If you have technical issues, like we've already seen some this morning, please send the host a message and we'll try to help sort that out. So first off today, we'll provide a quick introduction to the series, followed by comments by Max Schmid from the Environmental Justice Foundation. He'll share what are some of the social issues in the sector that we urgently need to address using a human rights due diligence approach. Following Max, we'll have comments from Chris Williams from the International Transport Workers Federation. Chris will discuss, with these known risks for abuse, what should companies be doing to address them. From there, Helen Packer from the World Benchmarking Alliance will share the Seafood Stewardship Index results, providing an overview of how companies are currently performing against human rights due diligence criteria. And then finally, we'll close it out with some lessons learned that FishWise has learned and some additional resources that will help you and your company convert what was shared today into action. As I mentioned, this is the first session in a series of webinars. Over the course of 9 months, we'll be presenting various topics that relate to human rights due diligence. The aim is for the series to provide companies with the resources, tools, training they need to unlock action and support successful implementation of human rights due diligence. Topics we'll cover include responsible recruitment, worker engagement, decent work at sea, and responsible purchasing practices. And if his audio is working, I'm going to try to switch it over to Andy Hickman, the head of Sea Alliance, who'll briefly speak to how these series fit into their key work areas.
Thanks so much, Garrett. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks very much, Garrett, and a really warm welcome to everyone that's joined the webinar. Really excited to kick off this series. For those of you that don't know, the Sea Alliance is a pre-competitive collaboration of retailers and seafood businesses aiming to strengthen human rights due diligence in seafood supply chains and ensure respect for human rights. We've been operating since 2018. However, we've had increased capacity since the beginning of 2022 when we had a dedicated resource running the initiative, which is myself. We just pop to the next slide. So our members represent a mix of retailers and seafood businesses, primarily focused on the UK, though many of our members are international businesses. Our members represent over 85% of UK retail sales. But despite the size of many of the companies involved with the Sea Alliance, we recognize that we need to build partnerships across markets, across sectors, in order to achieve some of the change that we want to see. It's worth me mentioning as well that Seafish acts as the secretariat for the Sea Alliance as well as the fiscal sponsor and has had a key role to play in the initiative since the outset. If we just pop to the next slide. So the Sea Alliance strategy is focused on 3 key areas. So first of all, we're seeking to improve the human rights due diligence that companies do in their seafood supply chains. So this means moving beyond desk-based risk assessments to focus on types of human rights due diligence that really benefit workers in the supply chain. And it's critical, in our view, to be working with workers' organizations, trade unions, NGOs in this work, those that are best able to advocate on behalf of workers and understand their interests. The second key area of work is around advocacy and engagement. So we all recognize that governments are critical to developing the regulation and enforcement that creates an enabling environment for good labour standards and human rights. So one of our key focuses is bringing together a broad coalition of actors to call for some of the key international conventions to be ratified and implemented. And we've just been doing some work on that, focused on the Cape Town Agreement. And we've written to over 40 different states regarding the Cape Town Agreement and advocating for its ratification. And then the third key area of focus is our Change on the Water Fund. So this is a fund focused on supporting improvement work at fishery or aquaculture farm level that directly impacts workers. And this is really in recognition that we see improvements in the supply chain as being a shared responsibility amongst all the actors in the supply chain. And the Sea Alliance really wants to ensure that we play our part in that. And the last thing I'd say before handing back to the team is just to say that we really see this as an iterative process, this webinar series. We want to learn as we go as to how we can improve the content that we're providing to you and the support that we're providing to you. So please do continually provide feedback on how we can better tailor the resources to your needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. So as we mentioned, as we were designing this webinar, we thought it's important, in order to be effective in our companies, we need internal support and buy-in. Alone, the silo of impact of one department will be limited. And the issues we learn about today and the steps required to address them will take internal coordination and support. Everyone has a role to play, and we've seen time and time again how lack of buy-in from one function can dismantle progress over time. So as Andy mentioned, this is a series that, but this particular webinar is tailored to those that maybe not are the usual suspects when we discuss these topics. The aim is to be really introductory, and we'll build a strong foundation for this work to help accelerate impact. The following webinars will be more advanced, and we'll build on foundational topics to discuss today. And we hope the invitation was extended to those that may be new and that could benefit from this 101 level. So I'm just going to pause for a moment. I'm going to launch our first poll to better understand who we have joining us on the call today. So please take a moment and submit your answers. Okay, I'm gonna close it out shortly, so please submit your answers. Okay. So I'm sharing the results. So it does look like we do have a good bunch joining us from the sustainability and CSR, but we hope you'll use this and this recording and share with other teams you think may benefit from this foundational approach. So now I'm going to hand it over to Max Schmid from the Environmental Justice Foundation to speak to the potential risks within seafood supply chains and the issues we need to address using a human rights due diligence approach. Max is the Chief Operating Officer at the Environmental Justice Foundation, where he has worked since 2011. At EJF, he has coordinated community co-management projects working with artisanal fisheries in coastal West Africa and gathered evidence of IUU fishing and human rights abuses on fishing vessels. He presents this evidence along with recommendations for greater transparency to governments, intergovernmental bodies, and industries across EJF's areas of operation in Asia, West Africa, and Europe. He's the technical author of the PAWS 1550 Code for Due Diligence Practice for Due Diligence in Seafood, and co-chairs the steering committee for the new Global Fisheries Transparency Coalition. Take it away, Max.
Thanks, Garrett. Yeah, just to briefly introduce EJF, although the biography covered a lot of it. We're an organization, we're headquartered in London in the United Kingdom, but we work across 13 countries. And in the area of fisheries, but also in other areas like climate change and forests, our model is to work with activists on the front line to gather information about environmental insecurity and human rights abuses, and then to present that evidence to decision makers in government, but also in industry. So we're delighted to have this opportunity today to speak to those working in industry on this important issue. To go to the next slide, I can explain why we work on human rights and the environment as a linked issue. It's well documented by the FAO and others that many of the ocean's fisheries are overfished. That means that fishing vessels and their operators, if they want to maintain the level of profit that they were making before the fishery became overfished, they're incentivized to either increase revenue or to decrease costs, or to do both. And unfortunately, one way of increasing revenue can be to get illegal revenues from illegal fishing, things like shark finning or killing other protected species. And also they can sometimes decrease costs, but also through illegal fishing, so not paying license fees, for instance, or the biggest controllable cost for most fishing vessels is the cost of labor. And so we see forced labor used to artificially suppress the cost of labor as the biggest controllable cost on a fishing vessel. And what that does is it leaves that fishing vessel or groups of fishing vessels operating in a fishery that would otherwise be left to recover. One of the great things about fisheries is they can recover if left to do so. But by artificially maintaining profits despite overfishing, vessels continue to operate in these collapsed fisheries, and we see that as a downward cycle with the incentives for forced labor and illegal fishing only increasing the more that vessels operate in these collapsed fisheries. That's why we call it the vicious cycle, and that's why we try and tackle illegal fishing and human rights abuses together as a linked issue. Go to the next slide. I'll focus in on what human rights abuses actually look like. We've done interview programs with fishers who've returned from work on a number of distant water fishing vessels, distant water fishing fleets. Ones from the European Union, from South Korea, from Taiwan, and from Flags Convenience. But the biggest distant water fleet and the one with the highest level of human rights abuses is the Chinese distant water fleet. And EJF has recently released 2 reports, the Ever Widening Net and Murky Waters, outlining the prevalence of illegal fishing and human rights abuses on Chinese vessels, and also exploring why we think it happens, and including policy reasons in the Chinese government that's allowing these vessels to fish illegally and mistreat crew at such a high level. And former crew who'd worked on Chinese vessels, we spoke to 116 of them over recent years, and they detail these very alarming levels of indicators of forced labor. The biggest one is withholding wages and creating artificial deductions from workers' wages, or demanding guarantee money. What that does is it locks workers think that they're going to get a particular salary, but when they enter the contract, end up on the fishing vessel, they find out that they owe money to the employer through artificial debts created, or artificial charges created. And that then locks them into working on that vessel to pay off that debt. That then allows the captain to overwork them, to work them for inhumane levels of hours, because they need to remain on the vessel. And is often enforced where those sort of contractual bonds don't work, through intimidation and threats and physical abuse. And almost 60% of crew on Chinese vessels reported physical abuse. Now, I emphasize that other fleets that we've talked to, all of these indicators of forced labor have been seen on other fleets, but the Chinese fleet has the highest levels. And our analysis of why that's the case, which we presented in the second of the 2 reports, Murky Waters, is there's a particular acute lack of transparency in the Chinese distant water fleet. Fisheries as a whole suffers from a lack of transparency almost inherently by its nature, because fishing vessels operate at sea away from the gaze of regulators. but the policy framework in China amplifies that and prevents decision makers in sort of port states and coastal states that are working with these vessels, or in industry who are buying seafood from these vessels, to see what's actually happening on them. So I'll then just turn to my last slide, just to flag out areas that EJF works with other NGOs to try and address this. The first is to confront that lack of transparency in all distant water fleets and in all fisheries, including sort of coastal fisheries and small-scale fisheries, through greater transparency. EJF set out 10 principles for transparency that would fundamentally shift the governance of fisheries into a mode that would make it much more difficult for operators to fish illegally or to use forced labor. And we're now working with Oceana, WWF, and other major international NGOs to develop a global charter for transparency that will set a sort of consensus view from across civil society of what transparency would look like, and what governments can do today to enact it. And then working directly with industry, we've developed a code of practice, which Garrett mentioned, the PAS 1550. EJF developed it together with Oceana, Pew, and WWF. And it was done together with industry actors on a steering committee where everyone's agreed to everything that's in it. And it sets out details of how groups can assess the risks that their seafood supply chains face, and also then how they can mitigate those risks. And connecting those back to transparency, one of the biggest areas of recommendations that comes out of the code of practice is for industry to advocate for transparency, not just leave it to civil society to be calling for these reforms, but also themselves call for transparency. Because for seafood buyers, the biggest constraint they have to making sure that they're not buying seafood tainted with the issues I described is that lack of transparency in industry. So I was very encouraged to hear that Andy set out that the Sea Alliance has identified advocacy as an important part of its mission, because civil society can't do this alone. We need industry telling governments as well that these changes are necessary. So with that, I'll close and hand back to Garrett and look forward to any questions at the end.
Thank you, Max, for your comments and for sharing those startling numbers from the crew. So given the issues that crews are facing and the scales of the challenges across the industry, how do we address this? The United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, often referred to as the UNGPs, have become the authoritative global standard on preventing and addressing the risk of adverse human rights impacts that's linked to business. The UNGPs set out 3 pillars. It's the duty to protect. This is the duty that governments have. The second pillar is the responsibility to respect human rights. And this is a responsibility that businesses have. And the third pillar is access to remedy. This is a recognition that even when governments and companies do their best to implement the UNGPs, negative human rights impacts may still occur. And when they do, how do affected people, how are they able to seek the remedy? But today we're really focusing on the one in bold, the company's responsibility. So let's dig into the responsibility to respect. A company under the UNGPs must at a baseline prevent and address negative impacts, know and show that they respect human rights, and demonstrate they understand the context in which they operate. To do this, an enterprise should have in place a public commitment to respect human rights that is embedded into institutional culture, an ongoing process of human rights due diligence informed by meaningful stakeholder engagement, through which an enterprise can assess risk to human rights, integrate the findings into decision-making in order to mitigate the risk, and track the effectiveness of these measures and communicate its efforts internally and externally. And then the third is they need to develop the process for remedy to anyone who is harmed as a result of the organization's actions or decisions. To discuss the roles of companies in preventing and addressing human rights impacts, I want to introduce Chris Williams from the International Transport Workers Federation. Chris is a fisheries expert and a socioeconomic specialist with 18 years of research experience in marine biology, fisheries, aquaculture, fisheries economics, coastal communities, and marine protected areas. Chris has worked on research, practical conservation, and community construction projects for NGOs, think tanks, trade unions around the world, as well as supported fishery organizations in the UK and abroad to lobby governments and access funding to develop community-supported fisheries. He now works at ITF in London in the fisheries section. Thanks for being here, Chris.
Thanks, Garrett. It's a good reminder that the next time I send someone a bio, I'll send a shorter one. So thanks. Yeah, I've been at the ITF full time since January. I've got a little background slide, which is the next one on the ITF. So the ITF is itself not a trade union. It's a federation of trade unions, and it supports fishers working at sea in the capture sector and also throughout the seafood supply chain, mainly through our sister organization, which is the IUF. Between all of the organizations who are part of the ITF, there's around 700 affiliated unions in 150 countries around the world, representing nearly 20 million people. Within that, there's only around just over 100,000 fishers. So as a percentage of our entire membership, it sort of reflects, you know, what you'd expect to find. Like in seafaring, it's a very heavily unionized workforce, up to about 90%, 80 to 90% in terms of union density. In fishing worldwide, it's probably between 1% and 2%. And given that there's probably more than 100 times more fishers than there are seafarers, it really hammers home the point that trade union organizing in fishing is actually very rare. So that's a bit of context. I mean, there's some countries like Argentina or Norway where it's very high, but on the whole, fisheries are pretty much an ununionized sector, in large part because lots of them are artisanal and just work for themselves. So the ITF, notwithstanding what I've just said, the ITF campaigns for better working conditions in the fisheries sector overall, and we are the social partner in the tripartite setup of the International Labour Organization. So we represent workers on the ILO, but we also work with the International Maritime Organization to secure the safety of fishers, and the FAO, which is obviously the environmental side of the food and agriculture in the UN, where we attend various meetings, but we don't have the same kind of status that we have in the International Labour Organization. And together with these UN bodies, we work to create a fairer, safer, sustainable future for our fisheries. We are an affiliate-led organization, so that means we only really step in countries if there's no national affiliate that is going to take on whatever project, case, or kind of campaign is going to be run. And that's really important, because that is a really important feature of how the ITF works, and something I think often other organizations don't understand. So we're a democratic body in ourselves, made up of around 700 other democratic bodies. So you can imagine what that kind of entails. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk about human rights due diligence in general, because I think that slide that Garrett just showed pretty much gave that summary in terms of the duty on countries and the responsibility on companies. But I'm going to put forward the ITF supply chain principles. Most of this so far relates to the transport sector at large, like haulage and maritime transport. But we really want to work with the Sea Alliance and others to develop something fit for purpose in seafood supply chains, which are by their very nature much more opaque and complex and in need of more intense human rights due diligence, we would say. So the demands of the ITF really are that all actors in the supply chains cooperate, protect, respect, monitor, and remedy. You won't be surprised to hear that, but our main focus in terms of cooperation is collective bargaining, addressing actual and potential impacts, building standards across sectors and industries, implementing the International Labour Organization standards, including health and safety, sanitation, education, and training, respecting human rights and recognizing and exercising that responsibility to also promote decent work, ensure that companies can't get around it just by subcontracting, so ensuring that subcontracted workers have access to the equivalent standards, and then monitoring. And this is something that I'll dwell on a bit later, but worker-centered human rights due diligence, mandatory human rights due diligence in legislation, that's what we want to see, and impact assessments based on various different forms of oppression in terms of workers' rights, gender, race, and things like that. So it's very easy to put forward kind of human rights due diligence and try to present something that isn't worker-centric, but for us that's absolutely important in both the remedy, in the monitoring, in the enforcement. It needs to feature workers. You can't bypass that and then claim that it's human rights due diligence, in our opinion. And then in terms of remedy, we have to cooperate to remedy both actual and potential risks. What we want to see is prevention. We don't want to constantly just be seeing reports that report how bad things are. We want prevention so that these things don't happen in the first place. So we need to prevent and mitigate the root causes of the risks, and then call upon all supply chain actors to develop those remedial plans with the ITF. Next slide, please. So an example that I can give is from our human rights due diligence work in the maritime sector. We were really struggling over time to get corporates to understand the human rights risk in their supply chains. So the way to basically highlight that is through looking for the most egregious human rights violations. It's almost like it's not the most, it's not the only issue. There's lots of lower level violations that are equally important to our members and far more prevalent, but they're not as newsworthy, and they don't tend to grab the attention of the retailers and the big corporates. So there was an opportunity, there's no other way of describing it, through the maritime crew change crisis during the pandemic. And we used that opportunity to highlight what companies could practically do to combat the risks of forced labor in their supply chains, which was happening all across the world as these people couldn't leave the vessels despite having overstayed their contract, despite having overworked their hours, everything else. So that risk was then clear, and the ITF decided to create some guidelines and worked with the UN Global Compact to create the COVID-19 Human Rights Due Diligence Guidance in conjunction with the International Labour Organization and the International Maritime Organization. Within that, there are only two key contacts that are put forward, and that is the ITF and the Chamber of Shipping. Now, there's a link there to the actual HRDD guidance, but I think it's quite important to note that we need to update that. That was specifically for the pandemic. So we need sectoral versions of this that are about the industry now, not about just the pandemic related risks. One of those should obviously be fisheries, which is why I'm talking to you guys today at short notice, which is why my presentation probably doesn't look particularly polished. Next slide, please. So what makes ITF different? And it's good you mentioned the past, because that obviously fulfills a specific purpose, but the other guidance that is generally made available around human rights due diligence doesn't have trade union partners. What makes that different in turn is that the central issue for us is freedom of association, the ability of workers to organize, join unions, and sign collective bargaining agreements. So we don't think that human rights due diligence can really exist unless it's worker driven and worker led, and that counts for inspections as well. We don't believe that that should all be something you can just sort out in the private sector, without any kind of like recourse or legal consequences. We have an inspectorate to enforce our ITF agreements in the maritime sector of 150 people in the major ports all around the world. 15 of those 150 now also have a fishing remit. We don't have any collective agreements in fishing, and that's something we used to have one with a big Spanish tuna company, but that's lapsed. And we're hoping to reinstate that agreement and expand on it and move into other areas and fisheries. But for the moment, what we're struggling with is this reality that most fishers aren't unionized or organized, so they don't have adequate grievances because they don't have collective bargaining, and they can't resort to a union to resolve the issues for them. So in parallel with the work we're doing kind of with companies and with human rights due diligence, we're also organizing in various parts of the world's fishing industry to basically build that kind of organizational structure. Some countries, migrants aren't allowed to form unions, so you have to have another kind of structure that gives them that same democratic control, and to then use that to then sign collective agreements with the companies. Distant water fishing, obviously, it's not like any other workplace. Being out at sea on a vessel with 40 people for 2 years is not the same as walking into a factory or a post office, sorting area. So obviously trade union organizing in fishing is extremely difficult. But our guidance and our work is based on experience. We have active projects in Thailand, which is expanding throughout Southeast Asia. We have a project in West Africa. We've had a project in Ireland for the last decade. We're running a project in the UK. We're starting 2 projects in Latin America, one in partnership with the ILO, and one in partnership with our affiliates in Argentina and Uruguay. And we've also had this one collective bargaining agreement on the, I think it was 8 Albacora vessels, which was the only collective agreement covering non-European migrant crew on tuna vessels anywhere on Earth at any point. Next slide, please. So, given the most egregious violations and the lack of union coverage, we really feel that you know, the fisheries sector is higher risk than some other sectors. So there should be enhanced human rights due diligence. To do that, we believe it's impossible to do that without workers' organizations and without workers at the table. We've got guidance, we've got experience, and we've got affiliates in, as you've seen, 150 countries around the world. But what I really want to emphasize is that ITF are stakeholders in this process. That is absolutely central. We're not auditors, we're not certifiers. You can't pay us to you know, to produce a report about your company or the fishing vessels or your supply chain, because that is not our role. We're a stakeholder in developing proper human rights due diligence, which delivers for workers. And we're also the only global maritime inspectorate that has actual data on the companies and on issues within those collective agreements. So I think, I guess you get the message that we don't think that there's a substitute for that. In fact, we think that that's a major part of the problem. You can't bypass that, because human rights due diligence is about the risk and potential risk to workers, not to the image of a seafood business or to their kind of security of supply. Next slide, please. So another thing I'd like to highlight is that at the end, well, in a couple of weeks actually now, we have a delegation visiting from the United States who set up the Fair Food Program, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. It's not a union, that's important to say, but that is because the people they work with are migrants mainly from Latin America, who are working in farming in the United States and are not allowed to join unions. So they set up a worker-driven social responsibility model, much like the Bangladesh Fire Accord that was set up in conjunction with unions. They are coming here to meet ITF, to meet some of our partners, to meet some of our affiliates, to meet retailers, and then also to visit some of the fishing ports and visit fishing federations, because we want to trial their fair food program model as a fair fish program model in UK fisheries, something that is genuinely worker centric and is not just a third party audit or certification. What makes it different is that WDSR involves workers in the design and implementation, ensures that money from the corporations incentivizes labor rights compliance, and ensures that the monitoring and enforcement is done through information from workers and with workers, and is not marginalizing them in that process. The agreements between buyers and workers are legally binding. Again, this is not a voluntary measure, this has teeth. And the final one is that there are economic consequences, both good in terms of price premium and benefits to the companies who can demonstrate that they are fulfilling their side of the agreement, and also negative for those that fail to meet their expectations and their obligations. Next slide, please. You'll be pleased to know that's it. If you want to get in touch, those are my contact details. Thank you. Great.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for joining us today. And we're excited to hopefully bring you back later to dive in more to the worker-centered approach and following those updates from that delegation. So thank you again. I think in order to just continue to try to build this foundation that we'll continue to build off for future conversations, we're just going to kind of quickly go through the human rights due diligence process at a very high level. The following webinar will move deeper into it. But again, it is a process that workers need to be, it needs to be worker-centric. The next, on the next slide, you see that human rights due diligence should cover adverse human rights impacts that businesses may have caused or contributed to. It will vary with the complexity of businesses and the risk of those impacts. It should also be ongoing, recognizing risk and business operations change over time. So this is an iterative process. It can be broken down into 4 main steps. It should include assessing actual and potential human rights impacts, integrating and acting upon these findings, tracking responses, and communicating how impacts are addressed. In February of this year, the European Commission has adopted a proposal for the Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. The directive aim is to foster responsible and sustainable business conduct, and it draws upon the UN Guiding Principles definition of human rights due diligence and requires companies to identify and, where necessary, prevent and or mitigate adverse impacts of their activities on human rights, such as child labor and exploitation of workers. So this is, a quick overview, and we will be diving deeper into this later on. But I just wanted to to pause here, and I'm going to launch the second poll that talks about, at a high level, and some of you may be more familiar with these particular steps, or these may be new to you, but would love to get your kind of initial impressions of which steps you're most confident in, and then where's some that you could use a little bit more work. And we will be building off of this in future webinars as well. So your input is really appreciated here. Okay, I'm going to close the poll shortly, so hit submit if you haven't already. So it looks like there's some confidence in identifying and assessing, and then kind of shared across the board on areas that maybe feel a little bit overwhelming or beyond your influences, integrate and act and track effectiveness. So again, we'll use these to help inform future webinars and providing you guys with the resources you need. So now I want to introduce Helen Packer from the World Benchmarking Alliance. She will talk about how companies are currently performing against these human rights due diligence steps. Helen leads the Seafood Stewardship Index at the World Benchmarking Alliance. Prior to WBA, Helen was the sustainability manager at Innova Foods USA, a subsidiary company of Bumblebee, where she contributed to the implementation of various environmental, social, and traceability projects. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you, Garrett, and hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So maybe I'll start with a little bit of background about the World Benchmarking Alliance. So it's a non-profit organization based in the Netherlands, and the WBA assesses the most influential global companies across many different sectors for their contribution to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And it uses those assessments to then inform collective multi-stakeholder action to drive change. And so food and seafood are some of the sectors that we assess on several environmental and social topics. And today I will focus on how food retailers and seafood companies performed on the topics of human rights due diligence, as well as forced and child labor. So next slide, please. So this is to show where our food and seafood benchmarks sit in our organization. So we have 7 transformation benchmark, one of which is the food and agriculture benchmark, which assesses 350 companies across the value chain, some of which might be represented on the call today. And within the food and agriculture benchmark, we have 2 spotlight benchmarks, one of which is the seafood index, which assesses the 30 most influential companies in the seafood sector, including aquafeed producers, fishing and aquaculture companies, as well as processors such as Thai Union or Skretting or Nisui, for example. Next slide, please. So WBA's social assessments in the food and the seafood sectors are divided in 2 sets of indicators. So first, there are 18 core social indicators, which are applied to all companies across all WBA benchmarks, so they are sector agnostic. And this is where you'll find our human rights due diligence indicators. And then there are the food and seafood specific social responsibility indicators, which are only applied to the food and seafood companies. And this is where you will find our forced and child labor indicators, as these issues are considered particularly prevalent in the food and agriculture sector. Next slide, please. So as Garrett mentioned, companies have an internationally recognized responsibility to respect human rights, as is articulated by the UNGP. although the UNGP breaks down human rights due diligence into 4 steps, as Garrett just mentioned, we've broken it down into 5 steps. And the reason for that is that these steps, the step of identifying and assessing, actually merit a separate analysis when assessing companies, because identifying means identifying overall risks and the types of risks by location and activities, while assessing means defining which ones are the most salient. So based on our experience assessing companies on this topic, we often see companies actually meeting the first, so identifying, but not the second, so assessing. So this is why we've separated them to ensure that we capture that. So we developed indicators for the first 3, so that's identifying, assessing, and integrating and acting on, as these form the foundation of the due diligence process. Next slide, please. So here you see the requirements on the human rights due diligence indicators in more detail. Here it's good to note that while the indicators ask companies to describe their processes, the indicators are not very prescriptive on what the process should look like. This is done on purpose because a human rights due diligence process should be tailored to the company's characteristics, where it operates, what the value chain looks like, or how the company sources its labor. So these are all elements that can alter due diligence process. And the indicators therefore focus on disclosure of the process itself, including what factors are taken into account and the outcomes of these processes. And when assessing these indicators, we look for evidence that processes at least encompass both the own operation and direct business relationships, include all geographies, products, and risks, and is ongoing. So we look for evidence in the last 3 years. And this is because due diligence processes should be repeated and assessments should be updated. Next slide, please. So here are how companies performed against the 3 human rights due diligence indicators. On the left, you can see the performance across all the sectors we have assessed so far, across all our different benchmarks. So this assessment so far covers 1,000 companies across various sectors, including automotive, garment, and electronics, to name a few. And next you can see how food retailers and seafood companies performed. And overall, you can see that even though food retailers perform slightly better than the average across all the sectors, there's still room for improvement. And when it comes to seafood companies, these tend to actually underperform the average across the 1,000 companies, the average of the other sectors. Next slide, please. So the forced and child labor indicators are structured the same. So this is why I'm not going to go into detail, but they're scored on a 2-point scale. So instead of going into detail, thank you, I'll just highlight the elements that we award with different points. So essentially, we assess whether companies have a strong public commitment, usually a public policy, then evidence for monitoring and verification processes being in place, remediation mechanism in case of evidence being found, and finally, that reporting of progress. Next slide, please. So this is how food retailers and seafood companies performed on those 2 indicators. So food retailers, again, perform slightly better than seafood companies, but in both cases, there's still lots of room for improvement, with the majority of companies not having strong enough public commitments nor monitoring and verification processes in place. And only very few have the remediation mechanism. And we found that none of the companies report progress. So yeah, that's my last slide. So based on those results, we have simple recommendations that follow the UNGP and other guidance out there, which are really to start with a strong public commitment and then build internal capacity and awareness, such as you're doing today on this webinar, and implement human rights due diligence. And then finally, of course, monitor and communicate how risks are being addressed. Thank you. I'll hand it back over to you, Garrett.
Great. Thank you, Helen. It's helpful to hear how companies and as a sector we're currently doing in the areas that we need to focus. At the top of the presentation, we mentioned how for efforts to be successful, collaboration across different business roles is needed. Sorry, we have a bird waking up, so hopefully you guys are not distracted by that. But at the top of the presentation, so to share this, we wanted to just use our experience. FishWise has been consulting for over 19 years with different seafood companies and retailers, and we've identified 5 themes that we'd recommend as best practice for how to work across different business functions. But then also, these are helpful recommendations for working with suppliers and supply chain partners as well. So the top priority is to create dedicated time for teams to interact and plan collectively and ultimately align on purpose. For example, FishWise was able to support a hospitality company in convening its executive leadership as well as directors across multiple business functions, including communications, operations, purchasing, marketing, and so on, to have a day-and-a-half workshop. While this is a significant investment of time, it was proven to be highly valuable to gain alignment on the purpose and how they want to approach this collectively. But importantly, it also moved beyond just talking about the issues, and teams had dedicated time to create short and long-term action plans that help them achieve their purpose. The second is to move beyond that one-on-one dedicated events. There needs to be consistent conversation across divisions and teams. Continual feedback loops where people are able to, the ones that are working closely with suppliers and workers, is essential to have that iterative and informed process. We found that if you get to know daily operations across different business functions, it'll help you understand how your work streams relate to others and where you can tap and support efforts. So one of these is, for example, have you ever considered how QA and human and labor rights connect? Workers tend to be that first line of QA, seeing the product, and when they're in a safe and empowering working environment, they can be more effective at that job and actually, identifying issues before it becomes larger. The third finding is to take a look at how company structures help or could hinder this collaboration. Is there board or executive sign-off on policies? Are there formalized connections between responsible sourcing roles and purchasing teams? Or if other business functions are already engaging with suppliers and collecting data, how can we embed the human rights due diligence process into some of those existing structures already? We also have found that if this comes off as a CSR effort in a silo that someone else has to do, it's not as successful. It goes back to that feedback loop. Procurement and other teams must also be able to represent the challenges and concerns of suppliers. And then those responsible sourcing roles really need to listen and adjust accordingly to that feedback. And in turn, the teams need to have confidence that CSR can speak confidently about these topics. On a very practical note, concrete messaging, resources, and examples help enable teams to work more effectively through that creating that shared language and expectations and understanding of the issues. For example, aligning around frameworks for the information for all teams to receive and hear helps create that common language, kind of like the intention of this presentation today to be that 101 and help kind of just set that foundation to enable your work more. It's important to make it clear that what guidance you're leaning on and continue to use that to provide that consistent messaging and structure. And then finally, human rights due diligence is a process that extends beyond just the seafood category. The process can and should apply to all commodities, so there's real value in leveraging the work of other segments. However, as we mentioned earlier in this presentation, some commodities like seafood will need special considerations based on the unique nature of the work, like distant water fishing. For example, you'll have to take into special account, like sourcing from vessels, tracking time at sea, as well as geographic and cultural context that will impact your work. Companies have to strike a balance between accommodating seafood's uniqueness within finding efficiencies in the due diligence process. But in our work, we found that when you address seafood specific risks, it actually can help catapult your work and accelerate other parts of other functions of your business as well. So if you're struggling with siloed teams, you take a look at those 5 recommendations and see if maybe there are some new approaches or new avenues for you to explore. To bring these recommendations to life and to organize existing resources and guidance out there that you can share with your teams, as well as to deepen your knowledge, FishWise created a free online platform. FishWise, with the support of the Walmart Foundation, created the roadmap for improving seafood ethics, or also referred to as RISE. It takes the guesswork out of implementing a robust social responsibility program. It's a free online platform that helps companies navigate the challenges and create conditions for decent work across the seafood industry. It's aligned with the UN guiding principles and incorporates a human rights due diligence approach. RISE has been used as a foundation for many pre-competitive collaborations work, including the Global Tuna Alliance's Social Responsibility Toolkit, Sea Alliance's Capacity Building, and CPAC actions. RISE provides companies with 8 roadmap steps to begin, expand, or improve their practices. It provides in-depth information on 3 salient risks in the seafood sector. These 3 issues are significant sources of risk and vulnerability for workers. RISE provides solution-oriented framing and aims to promote action in these areas. Improvement in these areas will unlock significant positive impacts in the seafood supply chain. And we'll be going more in depth and discussing these in later webinar series. To provide further information, RISE also includes free e-learning courses. We have 4 courses, one for retailers, one for suppliers, and then we have 2 deep dives on decent work and responsible recruitment. We encourage you to check these out and share them with your team. They take about 15 minutes and again, are free and easily accessible. You just need to provide your email. But one of our retail partners has required this of all their seafood suppliers and has found it really helpful. So with that, I want to make sure we have, I see Chris has his hand raised.
Hi, hopefully a quick question.
Yes.
Months ago, speaking to someone who worked for Conservation International, I was in a long discussion with her about some other work we're doing. And I said, well, why are these tools claiming to be human rights due diligence tools when they're not? And she said, oh, they're absolutely not human rights due diligence tools. So I looked on the RISE website and it said, this is a human rights due diligence tool. And I pointed that out. And she said, oh, no, well, that's a terrible misunderstanding. Wrote to the other people involved in it, who then took out that reference. But I noticed in what you just said, you've just made the same claim. So could you sort of expand on that and talk about the worker involvement, please? Thank you.
Yes, and I'm not familiar with the specific claim that you are, but that it's the 8 steps and the recommendations we provide are to help companies move through a human rights due diligence process. One of the foundations we have is worker engagement, and that needs to be addressed and included. It was a worker-centered approach when we designed this as well. So we can definitely let's definitely continue to connect about that and make sure there's no confusion around that. But it's trying to guide companies and different segments of the supply chain through some tangible steps that they need to take.
Yeah, details about the worker involvement would be great.
Yes, we will definitely, and we will continue in future webinar series. We can continue this conversation too. So I want to make sure that we have time for question and answer. So we will drop these takeaways in the chat. We also wanted to provide you with some quick recommendations based on the time you have to dedicate it either today or later on. But if you only have a minute, sign up for the next webinar. That'll be on October 20th, and maybe jot down a new piece of information that you want to check out later. If you have 5 minutes, share the recording and email some of these resources to a team member that you want to start this conversation with. If you have 15 to 30 minutes, we have the RISE e-learn, as well as a self-assessment that will send you some customized resources based on your responses. If you have an hour, just spend some time thinking about, what are your specific company's next steps. And then if you maybe have a day, work with a consultant to ID these steps and work to draft a strategy. So with that, I'm gonna launch a poll, but I would like us to also move into question and answer. And if anyone in the audience would like to come off mute or have a question, I see we have one that, does industry have a good handle on the salient issues globally? Would you say civil society is generally more informed than business? And would that be due to far better connection with workers and businesses' inability to access workplace at sea? Chris or Max, would you want to comment to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a crack at it, and then maybe Chris might have a more informed view than I do. I found that the awareness of industry varies greatly from company to company and from market to market. I think some markets, because regulation, market state regulation has put requirements on importers and retailers to ensure that their product is legal. They've put a lot of effort into addressing IUU fishing, which then, because it's close connection to human rights abuses, has enabled them to look at that issue as well as they've learned about it. Whereas other markets where those regulations haven't been put in place, there hasn't been the same incentive for industry to invest in this. And I think this is a complex area, and seafood is, because of its lack of transparency, is a difficult industry to understand the risks in, and often you do need that regulatory incentive to invest in it. Chris, would you?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, there's obviously there's some parts of the world, I'm thinking like the United States or the European Union, where there are much more sort of stringent requirements on companies anyway. But then the seafood industry globally is also hugely diverse. So I think it would be quite different if you were a fishing company that owned vessels versus being a retailer that might buy from a processor, who might have bought from a wholesaler, who might have bought from a co-op that might have 20 member vessels. So I think the supply chains are not sort of completely homogenous and standardized. So I think, the scale between ones that recognize the impacts they're having and have the ability to look at it, and those who just almost use the option of plausible deniability and saying that there's too many links in the chain, I think the variation is immense.
Thank you for those responses. Chris, I do want to send another question over to you about, can you provide any further information on worker-driven social responsibility model that would allow for accessible and trusted grievance processes?
Yes, so that I can actually share it in the chat. The best thing to, that only goes to hosts and panelists. The best thing to look at is the Fair Food Program, which has been very successful over the last decade in both the production of tomatoes and milk. So the Milk with Dignity, and then the Fair Food Program on tomatoes. You can read about that. And if you look at the section that says about the Fair Food Program, you can look at the 4 components of the fair food model, which basically combine worker-to-worker education, a 24/7 complaint resolution kind of hotline, market-based enforcement, and then also rigorous auditing, which basically comes together. They have a code of conduct and a fair food agreement, which is the agreement between the worker and the buyer. So I mean, you can read about that in detail in the 10 years of experience they've had. It's never been tested in fisheries before, so I can't provide a template for what it's like in fisheries yet, but I mean, I would say within a month we'll have a pretty good indication of whether they think there's potential for doing it. Again, I'd like to highlight the issue that a tomato farm is much easier to get workers together and have the worker-to-worker training than fishing vessels that are leaving and arriving at completely different times in different ports. So I mean, it's not a simple copy and paste job. But I mean, yeah, the first thing we'll be doing once we know if it's feasible and we've got a pilot is we'll be coming back to our retailer sort of contacts, mainly through this Sea Alliance, and then we'll be sure to present all those findings, or we'll get the coalition of Immokalee workers to come to one of your online webinars. If you're running it for 9 months, we'll have something to tell you before the end of that.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I look forward to
the reality is it's never been done before, and I don't want to preempt it either good or bad. I'm by nature extremely cynical, but I'm in this case quite optimistic because they've managed to run it successfully for 10 years, notwithstanding the differences between sectors.
Great. Well, we look forward to hearing more about that. I do realize we are over time, so thank you for those that are able to join us. If I do see we still have some attendees on, so I would like to continue with these questions. And for any participants that have questions that we might not have time to further get to today, please make sure you send them in the question and answer, and we can circulate a document answering those later. But there's a question here, Max. Can you provide any insight into how you've been able to engage directly with workers in a way that's safe for those workers and allows them to speak openly about their experiences?
So we speak to workers when they've returned home, and then they introduce themselves to us mainly through word of mouth of meeting other workers who've talked to us, or support shelters or other groups in the countries where we're doing this that support workers. And then they can approach us at a time when they feel safe to do so, when they're well away from the interactions with the vessel and brokers and others. I think others, including us, have looked at times at speaking to workers when they're in port, but I think that's a higher risk activity than speaking to workers once they're at home and they're able to access sort of safe networks of support to then reach out to us. And then before we speak to them, we go through a informed consent process to make sure they understand completely what we intend to ask them about, but what we would use that information for, and give them various options ranging from not use it at all to use it anonymously. And then we almost never release anyone's identity unless a worker's already chosen to do that themselves before that, and gone public with their story. We might then, there's one or two workers that appear in our films where that's the case, where they'd already made themselves public, but we would never really make a worker's identity public.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely some special considerations around privacy and protections for workers. So thank you for sharing. And with that, I think we're going to close it out for the day. So thank you very much for joining us and being here to learn with us today. Again, a recording will be sent out, and we will follow up, but please don't forget to sign up for the next webinar on October 20th. And that will be, we'll dive deeper into human rights due diligence and get into some more of the nuts and bolts. So we'll build on this foundation and keep moving forward. So thank you very much for being here today. And we look forward for you guys joining the next one. Thanks.
Thank you.